this and the appeal. I'm Alana Sivin, and today we are going to be talking about the evictions crisis in Nebraska. After a decline in evictions just last year, landlords in Nebraska have resumed an aggressive push to kick people out of their homes during a still raging pandemic. And this rise in evictions has been taking place despite state and federal moratoriums, which are supposed to be in effect through May and June, respectively. And as soon as those protections expire, thousands more households across Nebraska will likely be at immediate risk of being forced out onto the street. Now, based on what we know about this broader trend of this pandemic and previous eviction trends in Nebraska, what we know is that those evictions appear poised to reinforce the existing racial disparities and segregation in the state's metropolitan areas, and to cause a wave of displacement that will hit Black and Brown residents the hardest. Now, elected officials in Nebraska have sought to meet this crisis with a variety of solutions designed to offer some level of protection, and protection to tenants who have fallen behind on rent and who could be at risk of eviction. And today, we are joined by one of those legislators who's been at the forefront of that fight, and that's State Senator John Kavanaugh. State Senator, thank you so much for being here today. I know you've worked on a few different legislative proposals to address the forthcoming evictions cliff. But before we talk about those, I'm hoping you can help break down the scale of the crisis that's currently unfolding. So talk to us about how many people are currently being evicted, how is that problem likely to get worse, and particularly how is it likely to get worse once the moratoriums expire this summer?
Well, thanks for having me here, Alana, and thanks for your continued interest in the subject matter and advocacy and reporting on it. So yeah, Nebraska is, well, not unique in the sense of how evictions play out. We have a system that is pretty stilted in landlord favor. And so the bills we had this session, I can't remember, I think it was 17 bills actually were brought this session to address some aspect of landlord-tenant relationship. And we can talk, I guess we can dive into it a little bit later, but we passed one, which I'm hoping will be signed into law today. But you're right, the moratorium's been in place, and there has been a problem really enforcing that moratorium here in Nebraska, and that is what my bill sought to address. And we have seen, even now that the moratorium is still in place, landlords have been finding ways to work around that, which includes things like ending leases as opposed to evictions, and moving people month to month and not renewing them. And so finding other ways to operate within the legal confines of the system, but to the disadvantage of tenants, and making them ultimately homeless. So I guess I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. I'm sorry, I should have prepared that for today, but we thousands of people are evicted every year in Douglas County, which is the county that I am from and that I represent a small portion of. And we expect that those numbers will rise again, even higher later on this year when the moratorium lapses.
Well, then talk to us a little bit more about, you mentioned the bill that you're hoping is passed today. So talk to us a little bit about that bill. I believe it's LB 320. What sort of protections does it provide, and do you expect the governor to sign it?
Yes, it's LB 320 is a bill that has a number of changes to the landlord-tenant law. The one part is extending protections for victims of domestic violence. So under current Nebraska law, a victim of domestic violence can be evicted if they do not, if they allow a crime to be committed in their apartment, which includes being the victim of a crime of domestic violence, if they do not report the crime or seek a protection order. Mm-hmm. So someone could be victimized and then be evicted by virtue of the fact that they were victimized. So what my bill does, what that bill 320 does, is extends that protection if you also seek services from a certified or qualified domestic violence, like shelter or service provider. So they can get a certification and say that they went and sought services, because there are a number of people who do not want to avail themselves of the criminal justice system for reasons that are their own, but often because they do not trust this criminal justice system. And then it also extends a protection that would allow a victim of domestic violence to get out of the lease if they are victimized. So currently, if someone is victimized and they don't want to live with their victimizer, they then would have to move and find somewhere else to be. But if the person who has hurt them decides to stay and refuses to pay the rent, then the victim or survivor of domestic violence would be both out of a place to live and out of money and run the risk of ruining their credit if they refuse to pay. So this creates an out that if someone seeks those same services through a third-party provider or a protection order or reports it, then they can break the lease without penalty. So that is a big improvement, I think, in the law. So that's one part of it. The other, I would say, big part is changing our continuance laws around evictions. Under Nebraska law currently, to get a continuance in an eviction case, you have to put up the back due rent and you have to show extreme cause, which the courts were not granting even in instances of COVID, which was making it problematic for people to avail themselves of the moratoriums because they weren't able to get a continuance to get documentation and things like that. But further, having to put up money to get an access to continuance of courts, offends my sensibilities, I guess. And so I was very much opposed to people having to pay to get a continuance. And sometimes whether or not back due rent is actually due is an issue in a eviction if you're going to contest it. Some people actually pay the rent and the landlord mischaracterizes it, and therefore they would, the tenant would win a case. Mm-hmm. So that fixes that part of that, at least on the first continuance. Subsequent continuances are still going to have a standard, a higher standard, and a requirement of putting up forward going rent. So that was a compromise between our side and landlords. And then there's a few other technical parts about record keeping and pleadings. And then there's a part about notice to entry in there. So it's got a lot of good substantive changes, improvements that will actually, I think, make a difference in eviction court in the state of Nebraska. It was passed last Thursday. The governor has 5 days to veto or sign it. Today is the 5th day. So we are hopeful. I'm hoping that he'll sign it, but if he doesn't sign it, at least he doesn't veto it, and it would become law and go into effect in September of this year, which I think would be a big improvement in Nebraska, and we'd be very happy about that.
So a few follow-up questions about the legislation itself. So you talk about how if somebody is in a situation where they're experiencing domestic violence, that once they go to a third party or seek a protective order or something like that, that they do not face this threat of eviction. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what the restrictions are around third party? Like, is it a local community organization? Can it be, a faith leader? Just sort of interested to hear what the parameters of that are.
Yeah, that's a great question. That was actually one of the compromise negotiations around the bill. Ultimately, we settled on a definition of a qualified party under the Violence Against Women Act. The Federal Violence Against Women Act defines these parties, and then they are certified through the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services. So there is a finite list of these organizations, and they already are service providers that have basically been approved by the state. So I don't know the exact number, but it's not a large number, but it includes, at least in Omaha, which is the big city, the biggest service providers.
Mm-hmm. You also talked about some of the continuance fees and the piece of the legislation that works against those. Are there any other sort of fees in the evictions process that have created barriers, or other than the ones that you've already mentioned? Or perhaps even create more protections for people who are facing evictions?
Well, the fees, we have a lot of court fees in Nebraska. I guess I don't know about other places how they fund, but we've got basically about $50, $60 in court fees currently on any case. And in eviction court, if the tenant can be assessed the fees as well as any judgment against them as part of a judgment. So that is not necessarily a barrier for the tenant. We did have a bill, ultimately my right to counsel bill, which would have assessed a fee for filing of evictions to help pay for the right to counsel. That was another compromise we made, is to make that bill more palatable. Ultimately, I think if I bring a right to counsel bill again, I would have it be funded out of general funds, because I don't think that compromise got us any further than the idea itself. And fundamentally, I don't think people should have to pay for access to justice, even if landlords were opposed to the fee because it increased the cost to get into evictions, which was not a deal breaker for me. But ultimately, the tenants are the ones who will bear the cost in an adverse judgment. So keeping just the cost of operating courts, access to courts for everyone, is important, keeping it down. We actually had a big fight. I fought and kept an increase in fees off of criminal cases this year, but they did add it to civil cases in the state of Nebraska, $6 increase in fees, but we kept it off all criminal and traffic cases. So we continue that fight too.
I'm glad you brought up the right to counsel bill, because I think a lot of us were wondering what happened there. I know it didn't advance out of committee, and it sounds like you tried to even make some compromises so that it would. So why didn't it advance? I mean, it seems like such a pretty common sense thing to do.
Yes, it's one of those ideas that's time maybe has not come yet in Nebraska, but it is definitely has its own logic that is so convincing that it is growing momentum across the country. I think we got a better response than we thought we would on initial bringing it, considering this was the first time it's even been discussed in the Nebraska legislature. I do think that LB 320 solves some of the problems we did not address in the right to counsel bill, meaning that if we had passed right to counsel without LB 320, it would have had some implementation problems because of the structure of our continuances here. And so since we've improved the continuance structure, that will help the eventual, when we pass a right to counsel bill, it'll help it be more effective and easier to implement. So that is part of the conversation we had at least on our side, of saying, let's address these structural problems that we would have to address if we passed right to counsel first and help it that side. There's a cost associated with it. The way our courts are structured in Nebraska, it would have been a cost borne by the counties and not the state. We probably could find a way to direct state funds to it, but that would have been on a year-to-year basis. And so the counties are ultimately the ones that are going to bear the cost. We did get what we call fiscal note here, which is to say how much the counties say it would cost them. And I was pleasantly surprised at the economy of it. The county I come from, Douglas County, said it would cost them about $1 million to implement right to counsel in Douglas County, which is a great price considering. And I think we just continue to make that now that we know that that's what they say it costs, we can get all of our ducks in a row about the cost savings on the other side. I always tell people I'm in favor of right to counsel because it's the right idea, and I think that it makes our system more fair, equitable, and just. But it also is good tax policy because it's a small investment on the front end of $1 million in Douglas County that's going to save us multiple times that in the long run in terms of all of the services and downstream effects that evictions and homelessness have on our community. And so it makes sense from both a justice perspective and an economic perspective. And so now we have one more point of data for that that's going to allow us to marshal that conversation going forward.
So then how do you explain the support for LB 320, but not LB 419, the right to counsel? Because it sounds like LB 320 kind of fixed some of the issues that you were talking about that could have happened in LB 419. It sounds like it was mostly a budget issue. What are your thoughts?
Oh, well, you're exactly right. It's a cost question. People don't want to spend money. 320 has a total cost of $25,000. So 419 right to counsel would have cost $1 million in Douglas County, would have cost $1 million. Basically, the total fiscal note was about $3 million across the state, but it probably would have been more cost with some of the other smaller counties. And there were implementation problems for how the smaller counties would implement it as well. But ultimately, people weren't ready to do it and are not ready to do it. But we're going to keep the conversation going. we're going to bring a bill. I told people I'm bringing a bill every year, every time, until we get it passed or until I'm not here anymore. But that's, there's other approaches. Many places have done it at a city level as well. Well, most places have. And so we have those options to pursue in Nebraska to build the case. And part of the strategy here is to start the conversation, build the coalition, explain the ideas to people so that we can get it implemented as broadly as possible, as quickly as possible.
So I also know that LB 320 did end up including a provision requiring the state Supreme Court to issue a report twice a year addressing specific aspects of eviction in the state. So do you think that will help advance the arguments you've been making for a right to counsel? Do you think there's hope for it to get passed in a future legislative session?
Well, yes, I certainly think the data collection part is important. That's the part that costs $25,000 actually, is the data collection. And I think that when we get a better idea of what are the causes and what are the types of evictions, because everybody imagines when you have that conversation, we say everybody needs a lawyer, you get a big response saying, well, if you can't pay your rent, you can't pay your rent, you shouldn't live there anymore. You should get out. And so being able to collect the data and say, well, not all of them are related to failure to pay. Not all of them are willful failure to pay. Not all of them are actually justified. There can be landlords that are mistaken or wrong. And so not every eviction is meritorious. And so being able to collect more data and point out those specific issues will be helpful in passing right to counsel. And I am confident that we are going to pass some form of right to counsel in my tenure here. And then whether it's the big ambitious one that we started out with, or if it's a more, moderated one just to start, is the only question in my mind.
So, Senator, I just received a piece of news showing that the federal judge just vacated the CDC's nationwide eviction moratorium, saying that it was that the CDC and prevention overstepped its legal authority when it issued that moratorium. So I'm curious to hear from you, and I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but I think it's important for our viewers to sort of hear about this development and how states are responding to it. What do you think is the next step for states to ensure that people are still protected despite this new ruling?
Well, I mean, a federal judge saying a CDC moratorium is an overstep is, obviously not the end all, right? States have their own independent authorities. But I would say that we have the same obligation as local entities that we've had all along, which is to help ensure people are able to stay in their homes, because the reason for the CDC moratorium was that they recognize that it is a public health crisis when you have people becoming homeless. Homelessness is a public health crisis, and therefore we have an obligation to address that as a matter of public policy. And we have worked on that. There's been, a lot of housing assistance that's come through the CARES Act and things that have been handed out by our local entities. So we have to continue doing that. I would say that, in Nebraska, we will continue to pursue it from that angle, which is to ensure people's ability to stay in their homes. I would say without the CDC moratorium, well, as I said before, we had trouble availing ourselves of it in Nebraska to begin with. But it is obviously useful for people when they did have a lawyer that were able to effectuate or perfect their claim of under the moratorium. So I think we have to keep working those through our services that we have in place. It's unfortunate, and I don't know if it's a federal district judge, if there'll be a stay as it's appealed. And perhaps we'll get to a point where the CDC would withdraw the moratorium before there's ultimately a final judgment, but I don't know that yet.
Well, actually, I have one more question. What sort of other pieces of legislation do you think are on the horizon, perhaps in future sessions or ones that you're looking at now, to sort of help keep folks in their homes during not just this time of crisis, but in future times of crises that could inevitably come up in the future, and just sort of generally?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, yes. So my philosophy, of course, and people have asked me, is this just about COVID crisis. And no, I mean, my landlord tenant bills, my the right to counsel bill, that's about how our system works. This is just an example of a time in which our system did not work. It's just, a great in terms of size example of failures in our structure. And these bills, 320 and 419, my right to counsel bill and the other landlord tenant bills, are attempts to make the system work better. And even if we pass both of these, they both become law, there's still plenty of room to fix on these things. We have an affordability problem, we have an accessibility problems, and we have to address those. We have in Nebraska, we have a lot of policy to help encourage development, but we don't have a lot of policy to encourage affordable development. We don't have a lot of policy when we give out subsidies or incentives to develop housing or buildings. We don't do a good job of requiring that they build affordable housing as part of that. And so I think that is a big step to focus on, making sure that there is more affordable housing. I mean, there's other parts of landlord tenant law, a source of income bill that came this year. We didn't get very far. I think we need to continue pursuing that. But I think making sure that there is more housing available for people, that there's more affordable housing in particular available. I think transportation is a big issue in my community in Omaha. We have a very big sprawling city that is very car centric. And so it's the difference between where jobs are and where housing is big. And so those are all parts of those same questions. And of course, healthcare questions, access to healthcare, and then other types of assistance are the things that I want to continue advocating for. We have a SNAP eligibility benefits bill on the floor. I think we made it through the second round. We're going to the third round, and it's another small incremental step that would be an improvement that will help people have a more livable life and more stable, which of course my whole thing is increasing stability in housing, healthcare, and access to food will help people with jobs, with school, and all of those things will ultimately help with crime. And that's where a lot of our money goes in terms of tax base, spending money on those sorts of things. And then we don't even need to go down the line of all of the criminal justice reform bills that I have, but I'm trying to work on the system from both ends, from inside the system and helping people stay out of the system on the front end.
Well, it's good to hear that, because it doesn't seem like you can address one without addressing the other. So
exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Appeal Live today, Senator. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about these bills, and best of luck. You're going to hear some news hopefully in a few hours about your bills.
Yes, hopefully. Thank you.
Thanks.
We did.
Well, I think what was really important to remember when conducting this or when having this conversation here on the Appeal Live is how structural inequities in housing have existed prior to the pandemic, of course, but COVID-19 really put a spotlight on them and really sort of magnified the degree to which we've seen how unhealthy, for lack of a better word, our current housing system is. And we've seen this in Nebraska, where evictions have gone up and people have become less safe because of those evictions, particularly during a pandemic where not having a safe place to live is a public health crisis, which is part of the reason why the CDC recognized that too and implemented a moratorium. It's also why the state implemented a moratorium as well. And so something that I think a lot of legislators are recognizing, and what the senator has been pushing for as well, is that yes, we have seen these issues more closely now, but the only way to make sure that we are all safe long-term is by getting at the root of what caused this housing crisis. And it might look costly if you don't do a full analysis, but just as the senator said, you invest the money now and you end up saving money later. saving lives and money later. Fewer people enter the criminal legal system when they're housed and safe. We spend less money on different services for people who are unhoused when you provide all of the support that people need during the evictions process. So it'll be interesting to see if these sorts of reforms start to take effect once people come to grips with that real reality that investing money now can save lives and save money later on. So that is all the time we have for today on the Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news. We'll see you next time.